Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justine Osborne and I manage the SunSmart Schools and Early Childhood program here at Cancer Council Victoria. I'm very excited to be able to present today's webinar all about sunscreen, presented by Dr Fabrizio Spada, an expert on all things to do with sunscreen. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land and waterways on which we're meeting from today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present and those who are emerging. I would also like to extend my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present here today. We are very lucky that we have access to a variety of wonderful outdoor spaces, and we want to make the most of being outdoors whenever possible. But being outdoors means we're exposed to harmful levels of ultraviolet radiation that can't be seen and can't be felt. So a question is going to come up on your screen, and please choose your preferred answer. UV is only damaging when it's hot. The answer is false. UV can be damaging when it's cool and cloudy. It can be damaging when it's hot and sunny. So it's mainly about the time of year, the positioning of the sun. So it's very tricky for us to think about UV on those cool, cloudy days. It's much easier to think about it when it's warm and sunny. But we're now heading into a period when UV levels are going to start to rise, and we need to be mindful that it isn't about temperature rising, it's about UV rising. Let's try the next one. UV radiation can still reach you even with a hat on. UV radiation reaches you directly from overhead, and so a wide-brimmed hat is fantastic for that direct UV, but UV can also be scattered and reflected. So we still need protection from that indirect UV radiation. So do you only need to cover up when the temperature is above 25, only in term 1 and 4, or when the UV is 3 or more? It's important to remember it's whenever the UV is 3 or more. It's not about certain temperature, not about heat and sunlight. So the best way to know about when the UV is 3 or more is to use the SunSmart app and widget. The SunSmart app and widget takes the guesswork out of what the UV levels are doing. And so they will let us know when the UV is forecast to be 3 or more for locations right across the country, right across the world. And it will let us know when we really need to cover up and protect from that UV radiation. You might already have a widget on your school website or your service website. It's easy to add, so you can get your website developer to do that. Otherwise, it's easy to download the free SunSmart app. Very important to create that barrier between your skin and the UV. So using clothing, sunscreen, hat, shade, sunglasses, because if you can see your skin, UV can reach it. We're going to focus on using sunscreen as a UV barrier. I will now introduce our sunscreen expert, Dr Fabrizio Spada, who will take us through all we need to know about sunscreen. Dr Spada is the Scientific Affairs Manager at Ego Pharmaceuticals and a member of the Sunscreen Working Group at Consumer Healthcare Products Australia, an industry body representing pharmaceutical companies in Australia. He also represents CHP Australia with Standards Australia when discussing SPF testing standards, and has been a member of many successful formulation teams in Australia, Europe, and the USA. And we're very lucky to have him here with us today. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. While I share my presentation, I'd like to thank Justine again for organizing this. I have to disclose the conflict of interest. And as Justine mentioned, I am the Scientific Affairs Manager for Ego Pharmaceuticals. But my intent today is not really to promote the products that Ego Pharmaceuticals makes as sunscreens, but just to give you the background of what it means to manufacture and market high quality sunscreen and what the constraints and the regulations are around it. So the main points for today will include what is a sunscreen, how does a sunscreen actually work, Do I really need sunscreens? How do we know which sunscreen is safe or good to use? SPF 30, SPF 50, SPF 50 plus, the numbers that appear on the front pack of a sunscreen, what does it all mean? And who should apply sunscreen? How should we apply the sunscreen products, and how much do we need? And when should we apply or reapply sunscreens? So just to start as background information, I did a bit of research myself, which is kind of pertinent to my role. And I looked at the SunSmart's key guidance regarding sunscreens. I understand this slide is particularly rich of text, but I'm trying just to sort of lay the common ground on this. Sunscreen should be labeled at least 30 or 50 or 50 plus, be broad spectrum, water resistant, for all children over 6 months. Apply sunscreen to any skin not protected by clothing at least 20 minutes before going outdoors, and reapply every 2 hours or after water activities. Make sure it has an Australian license, so it's an Austel number. I'll get into all of these elements later in the presentation. And monitor the expiry date, which is mandatory on pack. The sunscreen should be stored below 30 degrees and out of direct sun. Cancer Council recommends a usage test before applying a new sunscreen, and the widespread use of sunscreen on babies under 6 months is really not recommended. To help develop independent skills ready for school, children from 3 years of age and onwards should be encouraged to give and given the opportunity to apply their own sunscreen under supervision of staff. Sunscreen should be stored in a supervised cool place out of the sun. The expiry date should be monitored. Where children have allergies or sensitivities to sunscreens, parents should be asked to provide an alternative sunscreen, or children should be encouraged to play in the shade. The school messages that I could find include strategies are in place to remind and encourage students to apply sunscreen before going outdoors. Reminder notice, sunscreen monitors, sunscreen buddies, with time for this activity scheduled into the daily routine. The school community is educated about the correct use of sunscreens and the level of protection it provides. 20 minutes before going outdoors and reapply every 2 hours, or more frequently if sweating or swimming, towel dry and then reapply. So this is sort of what I could find in terms of what the messages should be, are encouraged to be in the school and childcare environments, which I thought was great. So now to dive into the questions, why do we really need sunscreens? The sun emits harmful ultraviolet radiation that can really impact our way of life if we do not protect our skin. I love the point Justine made in the quiz, which is, should we only protect when we feel the heat? From a scientific perspective, it's an excellent point to make, because heat is infrared radiation. UV is a different type of electromagnetic radiation. They sit, if you look at the rainbow, infrared is at one end of the rainbow below the red. The ultraviolet is at the other end of the rainbow beyond the violet color. So really, we cannot use one to get an indication of the other. So heat and UV really do not go hand in hand to help us understand how severe the UV index and the UV damage on our skin could be. UVA and UVB radiation from the sun directly contribute to skin cancer, and this has been proven in many studies. We are kind of, despite the name of the lucky country, Australia sort of sits in the southern hemisphere, and the ARPANSA, which is the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, has actually explained what factors concur to that incidence of skin cancer in Australia. Because of the elliptical orbit of the Earth around the sun and the inclination of the Earth axis, when it's our summer, we're actually on the short end of the elliptic orbit, and the inclination just pushes the southern hemisphere closer to the sun. So considering all of that, and some data also that we have about the ozone layer depletion, we actually have an estimate from ARPANSA that the southern hemisphere received about 15% higher solar UV radiation across UVA and UVB compared to the northern hemisphere. So that's also an important element to consider. Regular sunscreen use has been proven to reduce the odds of getting common non-melanoma, skin cancer, and melanoma as well. This is why on the pack you find indications and references to skin cancer, which is a very serious disease. So it's considered from a regulatory perspective a restricted representation. It's almost never allowed unpack, but because sunscreens are considered instrumental in the prevention of skin cancer, it's actually allowed to make references to skin cancer and skin aging, photoaging, directly on pack of the medicine. We also need to be aware that sunscreens are not really a suit of armor. It's not a guarantee that no UV radiation will actually hit our skin, but rather it's a coating on the skin, and it has to be combined with all the other elements that Justine touched on in the introduction. All the other long sleeve, long pants, the hat, the sunglasses, the shade. These are all elements that absolutely minimize those chances. Just to explain why we're talking about UVA, UVB, and overall UV radiation, just a visual diagram of the skin section, and what we know about the ability of the UV radiation to penetrate the skin. What we know is UVB, which is the one predominantly linked to DNA damage, especially at the interface between the epidermis, which is the top layer in that diagram, and the dermis, which is the one underneath that undulating line, is the one causing redness, or erythema as we call it, and also causing DNA damage, which is associated with melanoma. Melanin is the pigment that actually gives you a tan, and that's where the mutation might occur to actually cause a melanoma. We also know that UVA is actually more penetrating than UVB. So it will go beyond the layers of the skin where you get that erythemal redness response, but it will cause damage at deeper layers of the skin, in the dermal layer. So your collagen, your elastin, that's what will cause photoaging. And the estimates from the scientific literature is that 80% of skin aging, in considering genetic factors and whatnot, photoaging is 80% responsible for actually skin aging, which is quite important, whereas the DNA damage is more associated with the UVB. So the question that might come spontaneously, well, why don't people use sunscreen every day then? What we found from the research is that often they think that having a skin that doesn't burn easily and forms a protective tan is considered like a good reason not to apply sunscreen, because they don't burn, they get a tan, so why would they need protection? It takes too long to apply, it feels really greasy, oily, so what we would consider in the industry a cosmetic barrier. So the product just doesn't feel good enough. Sometimes it's expensive. You get sunscreens with particularly beneficial ingredients or particularly fancy technology, high protection, all of that. And sometimes the cost for the pack size is considered excessive. They forget. They just get ready to go out and like, oh, sunscreen, all right, I'll put it on sometime when I'm out. But we definitely do not want lack of confidence in the rigor, the science, the quality, the safety, and the efficacy that go into a sunscreen to become one of these reasons. So all the other reasons we can work on, people just distrusting the quality, safety, and efficacy of a sunscreen is not something we want on that list. This is coming from the whole industry. It's not specifically a position I have, or Ego Pharmaceuticals, definitely. But how do we know which sunscreen is safe or good to use? In particular, the word safe is key in this question, in this statement, because all sunscreens need to use pre-approved ingredients. So no one can go into a lab and formulate a sunscreen just using whatever ingredient they want. The Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA in Australia, actually lists all the ingredients that are allowed for use in a sunscreen. And anything that uses anything outside of that list is actually breaking the law, and it's liable of persecution from the TGA. There are many beneficial ingredients, though, on this list. It's by no means a restrictive list of ingredients. What it means is that all the vitamins, moisturizer, emollients that are present on the list, emulsifiers or whatever else, have actually been assessed by the TGA and considered low risk, high quality, high safety to actually be allowed in sunscreens. But remember, no medicine is absolutely and always safe. Even something, Panadol for children, every medicine has a risk. There is no sensible person that should expect medicines to be always and absolutely safe. There are many different committees and parts of the health department in Australia that look after scheduling, determining how safe a substance is. But the poison standard will have compounds, chemicals on that list that are assessed at different levels of risk and safety. For example, ethanol is on it. Think about, beer and wine and all that. That's considered a poison. Eucalyptus oil, we use it. Essential oils, we think they're natural, they're beautiful, they're really great. They are poisons. It's all related to the dose and the safety of the chemical that is considered. So please don't think that unless a medicine is absolutely safe, or someone guarantees that it's safe, you cannot use it unless. All medicines are assessed, and there's always a risk. Depending on the claims or the benefits of the product, some sunscreens are suitable for sensitive skin, for children, for dry skin, based on the testing that they go through. But all listed sunscreens must go through the same degree of rigor and compliance before even one pack of the product is put on a shelf. So look for claims such as dermatologically tested, suitable for sensitive skin or dry skin, suitable for use with children. Is sensitivity is an issue? So back to the question, which one is safe or good to use? It depends. It depends on your particular skin needs or the skin needs of the child, the students in this case, and also the ability to find the product that actually communicates benefits that might match the individual needs you have or the students have. All sunscreens with an SPF number on the pack are actually listed medicines. They are therapeutic goods. They're not cosmetic products. What does that mean? Again, as I mentioned, only selected active ingredients and excipients. So the active, by this, I mean the UV filters, the compounds that actually block the UV radiation from reaching the skin, but also everything around it, everything that keeps those active ingredients happy and stable and able to spread on the skin. Only selected ones can be used. So that's already a level of control for listed medicines. All the claims must be supported by official certificates from independent and accredited labs. So in our case, because we make sunscreens, we go out to labs that don't work for us and they test the sunscreens. And that must happen before the product is actually put on the shelf. So all that rigor has to be held as evidence by the manufacturer before we even tell the TGA that we're launching a new sunscreen. Nothing can happen after the fact. It has to happen before we market it. The composition is listed on what is called the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, or affectionately for us, ARTG. And each sunscreen with an SPF above 15 has a unique number associated with that listing. What does that mean? It means that on that listing on the website, the active ingredient concentration, so how much of each active ingredient is reported, and the listing summary is public. You can look it up yourself, either by the product name, or if you have the product with you, you can look it up by the number that is on the front of the primary pack of the sunscreen. And you can access it through the ARTG webpage. That sometimes it is a very important resource. You can even shop around for sunscreens, take a note of the ARTG numbers, and then do your own research and look at the different compositions and different products, if that gives you an extra level of control. The ID number has to be clearly displayed on the front of the primary pack and is preceded by AUST-L, so Australian Listed Medicine Number. The efficacy, safety, and stability of the formula of the sunscreen have to be tested before the product is released for sale. That is a must. Nothing can happen afterwards. That is a breach of the regulations and the law. The product, during the development, each formulation is periodically tested over the course of 26 weeks, about 6 months, at different temperatures in the actual packaging, whether it's a roll-on, it's a tube, a bottle, a pump pack, whatever is supposed to be sold in, it has to be tested from that type of packaging. To make sure the product is well preserved, it will resist contamination. Think about a tube, you put some on your hand, put on your body, go back and touch the tube. That product has to remain well preserved and protected throughout its use. At the right pH, we don't want acidity or basicity of the product to actually interfere with your skin because skin is sensitive to pH, and with the right consistency. If the products over time become too thick or too thin, that is going to impact the ability every one of us has to actually apply the right amount. And every manufactured batch, so everything that is made in the production plant, every batch has to be tested and is tested analytically to make sure that the concentration of the active UV filters match the listed amount that is in the ARTG. So every single time we make the product, it's taken, put aside, tested by the quality control department, and only when the testing matches the listing that is on the ARTG can that batch be released, packaged, and put on the shelf. So that's another level of rigor that is introduced. So are all the active ingredients the same? If you read the back of most sunscreens, there's quite a list of UV filters. So are they all the same? There are different active ingredients. Some of them, and here are the chemical names that I anticipated, such as diethylamino hydroxybenzoyl hexylbenzoate, are UVA active. And this is a chemical absorber, how it normally is referred to. Other actives, such as ethylhexyltriazone, octopyrrolene, are UVB actives, and they're chemical absorbers. But there are other ingredients, such as bemotrizinol, titanium dioxide, zinc oxide, are UVB and UVA actives. The former a chemical absorber and the latter a physical blocker. What does that mean? That means that chemical actives versus physical act differently. So your physical sunscreens, such as titanium dioxide and zinc oxide, act like mirrors. So once your sunscreen is applied to the skin, it will reflect the majority, if the product is well formulated, the majority of the UV radiation reaching the skin. Chemical sunscreens, chemical actives actually behave slightly different. They absorb the radiation in the UV and they digest it. That's the best analogy probably, and return or eject the radiation as heat in the infrared region. So it's a different mechanism, and it might also drive your selection and your choice in sunscreen, depending on the mode of action. One is not better than the other. What we do know is that chemical filters can, in people that are predisposed to sensitization because of other issues, other chemicals, the skin can become more sensitive and sensitized to chemical absorbers. That's why there's always a recommendation to test on a small patch of skin, test the sunscreen before you cover as much of your exposed skin as you can. But if it's hard to navigate which particular chemical active might be the reason behind the sensitivity or the sensitization, often physical sunscreens, titanium and zinc oxide, are the ones that help eliminate that issue. It doesn't mean that chemical filters are unsafe. It's just because of the chemical nature of those filters, the skin in some subjects may have developed a sensitivity that will be triggered by those actives. But those chemicals have been assessed by the TGA, considered safe for use in sunscreen. There's a wide range of options. So often the recommendation is don't try to figure out which active is the one causing the problem. But if you realize that most chemical sunscreens give you a problem, physical blockers such as zinc and titanium might be a valid alternative for that. What does SPF mean? What does that number mean? Sun protection factor is the measurement of the time. This is in the external lab, the work that we do at the external labs. The time needed to cause an erythemal response, redness, in protected skin versus unprotected. So the lab will apply the sunscreen, measure a spot that is not protected, then measure a spot with the sunscreen on and measure the time that it takes for both spots to have the same level of redness. That ratio will tell you how well protected. The longer it takes to cause the erythemal response, the higher the protection is. That's kind of intuitive. That's why a 30, a 50, or a 50 plus will usually go in that direction. 50 plus means, for clarity, that the measurement of SPF was actually longer than 60. So the value that was returned by the lab was more than 60. In terms of how much radiation makes it through the coating of the sunscreen, a good rule of thumb is 1 divided by the SPF value on pack will tell you in percentage how much radiation makes it through. So obviously, the higher you go in the number, the lower the percentage of UV radiation makes it through the skin. The testing method is standardized by the International Standard Organization, and there's a unique identification number for all the standards. In this case, for SPF, is the number 24444, and it is actually adopted in the Australian standard and New Zealand standard, which has its own number, 2604. So there's Standards Australia, as part of ISO, is actually monitoring and making sure that the best available method is used for testing sunscreens. It is a test carried out on human subjects, so it's actually in vivo, representative of what would happen in real life. And at least 10 subjects need to be tested to be able to calculate that number that will actually go on pack to support the efficacy of the sunscreen. The standard, the Australian standard, is being updated. It will be updated in January 2024 with the adoption of the new ISO standard for SPF, so this one, broad spectrum, and also water resistance. So there's a bit of change coming, but it's introducing even more rigor in the testing, more accuracy, more measurements of the validation of the method to make sure that that number is really representative of the efficacy. But what does broad spectrum mean? That is not something that you see on pack as a number, but just as usually a round circle saying broad spectrum. The testing method is standardized again by ISO with its own number, and it is adopted in the Australian standard. It is a test carried out on plastic plates. So this is in vitro, not in vivo, not on people. Because if you remember the diagram on UV radiation, UVA penetrates deeper and makes more damage, makes more harm. So ethically, we wouldn't test for UVA protection on people because we do know that some of that radiation will pass, especially the control where there's no sunscreen. And knowingly, we cannot ethically put people at risk of damage, of deep skin damage. So it's made in vitro using a UV spectrophotometer to measure the amount of radiation that actually makes it through. The test covers UVA protection, which is more harmful than UVB. From the diagram as well, as you remember. To pass a sunscreen, so to be able to claim broad spectrum, a sunscreen must have at least 1/3 of the SPF value, UVB, as UVA protection factor. What does that mean? It means that for a sunscreen that has an SPF value of 30 on pack, the UVA protection factor must be at least 10, 1/3 of that. And the external lab will provide all the documentation and method and analysis to actually support that for us and any manufacturer to be able to claim that it is a broad spectrum sunscreen. It provides reassurance that adequate protection is in the sunscreen across the whole range of UV radiation, because as Justine mentioned at the beginning, we cannot see it, we cannot feel it. It's not associated with heat. So how do I know that I'm getting enough protection in the UVB, the redness, the sunburn, and UVA, which is the longer term damage at deeper layers that I'm definitely not going to be able to even detect because it's not the one causing the redness and the sunburn. What about water resistance? The testing method is standardized. These are all the references and adopted in the Australian standard. It follows the method for UVA and UVB, but post-immersion. And the Australian standard is the only one in the world that allows the water resistance measurement to extend all the way up to 4 hours. If you go to Europe or if you go to America, it's a shorter time. You get 80 minutes, or actually 40 minutes or 80 minutes. And you can even allow for a drop in SPF. Australia has the strictest standard when it comes to SPF testing and post-immersion, so water-resistant SPF testing as well. The value cannot drop, and you can measure it and claim it all the way up to 4 hours. We're the only ones that allow that, that rigor and that efficacy. So it specifies the type of water, the volume of the pool and the spa, and the sequence of immersion and drying steps of the subjects involved in the study. So again, they want to have at least 10 people, like the SPF. So the question that I often get at this point is, well, if it's 4 hours water resistance, why are we saying that you reapply every 2 hours? Because the testing method is a standard method. There are many variables in the real world in terms of type of water, temperature of the water, activity in the water, it could not be accounted for in an ISO standard method. It would make the testing nearly impossible. So the ISO organization had to agree on a set of conditions to be able to compare apples and apples when it comes to water resistance. So even though some of them give the assurance that has been tested by ISO up to 4 hours, the recommendation is still when you go in the water, any activity, and you towel dry yourself or pad dry, reapply. You can never be sorry for doing that. It will always help anyone getting the best possible protection. The SPF claimed on pack for water-resistant sunscreen, so anything that you see with water resistance up to 2, 3, 4 hours, is the actual SPF value obtained after the immersion. The Australian standard does not allow any drop in SPF because of the water wash-off. So anything that is 50 plus 4 hours water resistance, it means that under the ISO conditions, the SPF value after 4 hours was still 50 plus. That's another level of rigor and reassurance that the Australian standard gives to anyone using sunscreens. So who should apply sunscreens? Everyone above 6 months of age when exposed to UV light, 20 minutes before exposure, and that is often the tough spot. We know from real data, real world evidence, then that doesn't happen. It's difficult to enforce that, but it is indeed the best way to make sure that that film on top of your skin is uniform, is dry, and it's the right thickness to actually provide the protection that is on pack. Anything stray, the more you stray from that, the more issues you might have to actually get the right protection. In addition to other protective elements such as sunglasses, white hats, long sleeve shirts, and long pants if possible. So again, it's not a suit of armor. Every 2 hours and after bathing, swimming, exercising, towel drying, even for sunscreens that claim 4 hours water resistance, it's still important to reapply. It's not a suit of armor, and it's not a Teflon coating that will never come off. UV damage is cumulative. That is also kind of the bad news in a way. The visible signs of damage that people start detecting in their 40s or 50s or 60s actually comes from damage in teens and 20s. So the earlier we teach everyone to actually correctly apply, reapply, and maintain sun protection, the better. Because even though the benefits may not be immediately visible, they'll thank you later. That's my point. How much should we apply? And this is also sometimes the trick. How much am I supposed to use? Because some of them are expensive, as I mentioned. Some of them are thin. Some of them are thick. So what is the right amount? The ISO method applies a standard of 2 milligrams of sunscreens per square centimeters of skin. I don't think that was helpful at all. What does that mean? It means that 37 grams of product are pretty much needed for the entire body per application. So if you're buying a 75 gram or 100 gram product for your body and you use it to go to the beach, it will actually last 3 times if you apply correctly. But again, what does that mean? It means, as a rule of thumb, there's a teaspoon rule that we thought, what the industry thought and the regulators thought it was probably some of the best way to intuitively describe what the right procedure would be. So at the moment, the guidelines are where we should use about 1 teaspoon for face, 1 for neck and ears, 1 for each arm and leg, then 1 each for the front and the back of the body. So if you approximately add it all up in terms of volume, you will find that you're close to that 37 gram of product. The dose form, as we say, the type of emulsion often plays a role, unfortunately, because if you go for a heavy, thick, oily product, that will not make it simple or easy or pleasurable. If you go to a nice fluid lotion, you might have a more enjoyable cosmetic experience, but at the same time, you might under apply because the product is easy to spread. So you may not end up putting on enough. Think of other convenient formats such as aerosols. Imagine spraying 37 grams out of an aerosol can 20 minutes before going into the sun. You're going to do it at home. You're going to do it in your living room or on the porch. You're going to spray yourself and probably the porch and the windows and the walls and the table, because it's just a nebulized aerosol of liquid. So often the type of product, whether it's an ointment, a cream, a lotion, a gel, a spray, or whatever it is, also plays a role to make sure that you actually apply the right amount on your skin. And the next one is my last slide. I believe, Justine, we have some time for questions.
As Dr. Spada mentioned, sunscreen isn't a suit of armor. It is the backup plan. So the first port of call is, first of all, check what are the UV levels doing today. I can't rely on temperature. I can't rely on the brightness of the sun. So I need to rely on the app or the sun protection times to tell me that. And then during those sun protection times, I do want to get outside. I do want to enjoy the great outdoors, but I just need to cover up and make sure that there is a barrier between the sun's UV and my skin. The best barrier that you can create is with covering clothing. Make sure it's not too hot, that it's loose fitting and allows airflow and doesn't overheat the person. You want to cover up with a wide brimmed hat, our sunglasses, and if possible, find shady spots. But there may still be some skin exposed. So the delicate areas of the face and the neck, the ears, bottom of the arms and the hands, bottom of the legs, sunscreen is your go-to for that. And so it's about finding the right sunscreen that works for you, that you're happy to apply, that follows the right things on the label, that's TGA approved, Australian listed, and making sure that you apply the correct amount in the correct way. Because unless we do that, the sunscreen can't do the job of protecting and creating that barrier as well. So based on all of that,
if I can add to that, sorry, Justine.
Yes.
One notion that we are aware of, from summer to summer, always check the expiration date. We know that we buy it, August, September, October, whenever the season hits. And if we buy a large pack, a pump pack that 500 grams or something, it's expensive. We don't want to find out that the following year we've kept using that product and it's actually expired. That's when you might get sunburn or you might get some issues because you're basically into unknown territory. The product was not tested past that shelf life. So it's not that the product is unsafe. It's just that we don't know. We haven't, the sponsor wouldn't know what happens after that time. That's why they said the shelf life is 3 years. Past the 3 years, no one really knows. And you're literally better off trying to find one that has the longest shelf life or buying smaller packs if you know that you're not going to use it all. And you don't want to be left with a lot of sunscreen for the following season. But do check the expiration date, please, like your medicines, like your Panadol, whatever else you're using, check the expiration date.
Great, thank you. We've got some brilliant questions that have come in.
Excellent.
Do you recommend adults to apply for a certain age?
Not sure I understand, but
I'm thinking it might be, and please clarify if we've interpreted this wrong, but I'm thinking from about 3 years of age, we encourage children to learn how to apply their own sunscreen under supervision, to give them lots of practice so that they'll be ready for that at school. And as far as adults are concerned, adults of all ages should be encouraged to apply sunscreen and use all other sun protection measures because it's never too late to have an impact on your health and to slow that UV damage down. So hopefully that answers that question. During a kinder session from, say, 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., how often should we apply sunscreen?
If you apply, say you're ready and you applied enough at 9 o'clock, it's a 5-hour span. I will probably look at 2 more applications.
Yeah. So every couple of hours, especially
so 11.
Running that indoor-outdoor program, you want to be flexible with that. So when you talk about the amount applied to a body, does this apply to an adult or a child?
It's very excellent question. That teaspoon rule is for a full-size adult body. Yeah.
Yes.
So if you still go by the teaspoon rule for a child, you can pull back a little bit for each one. But if you go close to a teaspoon, according to that rule, you definitely know you've applied enough for your child.
Yes. Obviously, it's very dependent on the surface area that you're dealing with.
Yes. Yes.
What do we say to parents who say their children don't need sunscreen due to their ethnicity or darker skin?
The study that I remember is that a full tan, even in the case of ethnicity, the protection that darker skin provides is equivalent to a SPF 4. So again, if you go by the rule 1 over the SPF value, 25% of the radiation is still hitting the skin, is still making damage. And because it's a cumulative damage day in, day out, that is a huge amount of UV reaching the layers of the skin where it shouldn't go. So even darker skins or tan skin, they still need protection because that equivalent SPF factor is really low.
Yeah. And obviously it's very dependent on the tone of skin.
Yeah.
So, that Mediterranean sort of olive tone is that SPF 4, that very, very naturally very dark skin has a bit more natural protection, but still really important to protect the delicate areas of the face, the eyes. Even those equatorial regions with really intense UV levels have high rates of cataracts with, eye damage. And also too much UV interferes with the immune system as well.
Yeah. And tissues such as lip and eyelid, even in darker skin people, they still have very high risk of damage. The other end of the spectrum, anyone with red hair or from, say, a Northern European background in red hair in particular, their melanin is mutated, is not exactly the melanin that other skin types have, and it put them even more at risk. So if you have red hair children, the opposite end, they probably need to be more careful with sunscreen application.
Thank you. The sun advice often says in winter, sun protection not required unless outside for a long time. How long is a long time? Well, that's possibly not your sunscreen expertise question. I'm not sure if you're comfortable answering that one.
Look, it goes back to the UV index, like Justine mentioned at the beginning. So any app or any monitor that you can find that will tell you how strong the UV index is. There is a case for start of the day or end of the day at low UV index where you probably can spend about 20 to 30 minutes if you're concerned with vitamin D and you don't want to go for oral supplementation, that you can still tackle those times of the day. But definitely as the sun gets close to the zenith, even on a relatively low UV index, but anything above 3, you still want to get some protection.
Yeah. So say if you're running a bush kinder and the children are outdoors all day in winter, it's probably a good idea to be considering. You'll be covered up because it's cold anyway, but good idea to consider the delicate areas of the face, back of the hands, things like that.
Yes.
Let's see. We're getting some great questions. Is there testing on the effect of applying sunscreen on the skin over a long period of time? The skin is absorbing these chemicals over many years, especially for children's skin.
This is an excellent question. What has been happening over time, and the TGA is working very close with other regulators such as the FDA in America and the European agency as well, is to actually constantly review chemical UV absorbers, because we know zinc and titanium sit on the skin, act as a mirror. There's not really a lot of interaction going on. But chemical filters over time, because of these reviews, have actually been dropped in terms of maximum allowed concentration by the TGA. Some of them have been also restricted, so cannot be used in certain types of sunscreens. So there's a constant review of safety data coming from the type of studies in vivo on people and over what is called a longitudinal study, which is over a long time, and understanding blood plasma levels, penetration of chemicals into the skin and what happens, how they are metabolized, how they're transformed, how they're excreted, the pharmacodynamics of the actives. There's a lot of work on that goes behind the scenes. And it's very valuable work. As much as a formulator doesn't like to know that next year they won't be able to use that particular filter anymore because it works well, but when the reason comes from a regulator saying this is potentially a risk, and there's one particular active that has been stopped as late of last year, and basically said you can use it, but down to 0.25%, which basically is not is not possible. It's not going to contribute anything. So that message comes to the industry as in stop using it, because you won't get any benefit from having 0.25% of an active in a formula. So that's the kind of work that goes behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And that also to make sure that safety, quality, and efficacy are always considered with UV filters.
So it's very much a work in progress. So we know from decades-long research that applying sunscreen is a really effective way of helping to create a barrier between your skin and the UV. But that's constantly looking at, well, which are the best ingredients, which are the best formulations, which are the best percentages to add, take away. And also you've got to make a sunscreen people are willing to use. And so that requires quite a talented formulation as well.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Does hair provide any UV protection?
Not a whole lot, no. Again, similarly to what a tan skin, skin with a tan provides, it's anywhere between 4 and 10 SPF based on the color of the hair, the density of the hair. Definitely not enough, especially with the level of damage that is reported every year on solar keratosis, on precancerous lesions on the scalp that require treatments like 5-fluorouracil and all those products. It is because there's a false sense of security. You have full head of hair. You don't need anything. Just get your hair wet if you're hot. But it's not really going. It's like the skin with a tan. Same argument.
Yeah, so that's why wearing the hat's important.
Correct.
And a lot of hairdressers are the ones that find the initial bump or some kind of change in the scalp, and then people go and get it seen to.
Yeah, correct.
Does sunscreen interfere with vitamin D absorption?
Yes, in the sense of the radiation, the wavelength, the UV wavelength that is needed to transform the vitamin D precursor in your skin into vitamin D is a wavelength that is blocked or reduced with sunscreens. But if oral supplementation is not acceptable or not preferable, there's still a position, at the extremes of the day, of the sunlight, early in the morning or late in the evening, to still get about up to 20 minutes at low UV index that will still promote vitamin D synthesis. Also because it's not, what we know about that process, it's not linked to the intensity of the radiation. It's more linked to the surface of the skin that you actually expose to that low angle UV radiation. So there are ways to still get the best of both worlds, minimize the damage and get your boost to vitamin D. But oral supplementation is a perfect way to do it.
Do we need to get parental permission to supply sunscreen to students?
I would suggest, as the guidelines suggest, to just test it. So if they don't come with sunscreen and there is sunscreens available at the center or the school, have a chance, and that's where the 20 minutes before exposure helps. Maybe apply it as early as you can on a small patch of skin. And often, and in the formulator world, this part of the arm is a good indication because the skin is a little thinner and also doesn't get any damage compared to the other side because it's usually protected against your body. So a small patch on this side of the arm, say at the beginning of the day before the break, will be my recommendation. With my 10-year-old girl, we did that because not all sunscreens agreed with her. So we would do, okay, we're going out at lunchtime or later in the day, get up, breakfast, get some sunscreen on, try different ones. The ones that feel fine and are okay, that's the one you're going to use. That would be my recommendation. Yeah.
And we would recommend, say, for example, schools, if they're going to supply sunscreen, choose the particular brand and have the details available on the website so parents know that's the one we're using, that's the ingredients. Are you happy with that one? But ideally, you'd want to put sunscreen on the school book list. So each child comes with their own sunscreen, one that they prefer, and then the school has strategies in place to remind students to apply the sunscreen they've brought. And the sunscreen you're supplying is that sort of emergency stock of sunscreen. And for early childhood, it's often easier for them to supply sort of the bulk sunscreen for everybody. But again, you inform families of which sunscreen you use, what the ingredients are. And if someone would like a different sunscreen, then you'd get that in writing and it'd be labelled. And I know a lot of early childhood services, along with their policy and procedures documents, include permission for sunscreen application to be administered. Okay, the next one, in winter, when sometimes the sun comes out, should we apply sunscreen? So it's getting back to that heat and sunlight question again.
I will go back to the UV index. That will probably be my first suggestion. Just check the UV index. Anything higher than 3, even if it's cold, put sun protection on.
Yes. How much protection does a long sleeve top and pants give compared to sunscreen?
That is a very good question. I have not seen a direct study comparing, say, a long sleeve versus a short sleeve on the same person with or without sunscreen. There's enough evidence that it's sort of a multi-factorial approach. So you do want the shade, you do want the long sleeves, you do want the hat, the sunglasses, and where you don't have any of this, you want the sunscreen. Yeah. So it's not a either or. It's not a switch, 0 or 1. It's all these elements together, and it's literally a hierarchy of controls. Ideally, you want to be away from indirect UV, which is the one that bounces around, away from direct one, and with as many levels of protection, depending on how exposed your skin is, as you can. Yeah. So I haven't seen a hard and fast rule. If you have a long sleeve, you can go out in the sun because you have an SPF of 40. I have not seen that. I think it's
and it's very dependent on the design of the clothing and also on the fabric that's used. So something that's got densely woven fabric, if you hold it up to the light and it lets a lot of light through, it will probably let a lot of UV through as well. So you're looking for fabric that you can't really see through, and you're looking for fabric that's not stretched on the skin, because once it starts to stretch on the skin, it's opening the fibers and letting UV in. So it needs to fit loosely, it needs to be densely woven, and it needs to allow that airflow so that you're, protecting from UV but not causing overheating either. And so not all clothing is equal. So sometimes it's about layering up. So you wouldn't go outside with a singlet top or a singlet dress and expect sunscreen to do the rest of the work for you. You'd layer up with a shirt or a T-shirt and then get the sunscreen to do the rest of the work for you. How do you know if SPF 30 or 50 is good for your skin?
I would recommend quickly, 1/30 versus 1/50. That will tell you percentage-wise how much UV is still hitting your skin. So depending on how long you're going to be in the sun, where you are, the angle of the sun, what time of the day it is, how long you're going to be outside, that should help you decide which one is best for you. 30, 50, 50 plus, they will all block more and more and more. But it depends. Skin feel is important, cosmetic acceptability, because you want to reapply. If you're just disgusted by the product, you're not going to reapply, and that defeats the purpose. So you have to kind of assess. It's a risk assessment in a way. You have to assess how long, how strong, what am I going to do in the sun? And then you decide, okay, a 30 might be enough for today, or I want a 50 or a 50.
A roll-on sunscreen is good for children?
Sometimes they're good. They're better. They're all good, roll or not. But the roll is sometimes helpful to see where you've been, to make sure that you're kind of uniformly applying over the surface. It's a convenient way of knowing before you rub it in and it sort of disappears, to actually see where you've been, especially for children, because they don't like to have it applied on them. They wriggle around, they want to go on the beach, they want to have fun and whatnot. It's often visually a helpful way to know, okay, I'll put it everywhere right now, I'll rub it in and off you go. It's a convenient way of dispensing it.
Now, we've had a couple of questions about olive oil and sun protection, and I think this has come because a few parents, there's often stories that are out there in the world. Yep. And people have come from lots of different places with those different stories. So I think some parents might think that olive oil is appropriate to pop on skin?
There's no evidence for SPF. There are some natural compounds that have been researched and they come with SPF benefits, but even when you look at, say, titanium and zinc, there isn't just one filter that does it. You always have to combine filters together to get the uniform coverage across UVA and UVB. Also, one point about olive oil, and I'm from Italy, so I'm really, really talking about something that is close, is also the fact that olive oil is quite good at disrupting the upper layers of the skin because of the structure of the oil. So it would actually penetrate the epidermis, and because of the structure of the oil, it will actually disrupt the packing that you want to have of the lipid layer in the skin to keep that barrier intact and cohesive. I would not recommend it because of low SPF and because of actual potential. If you then apply sunscreens or other products on top of olive oil, it might actually bump up the risk of irritation. So say you decide to use olive oil and go into the sun, you get maybe a little sunburn, you go back and you apply aloe vera gel or whatever you want to use as after sun. The olive oil in the meantime might actually loosen up your skin, which would in turn cause that follow-up product to cause potentially irritation, and you don't want to do that.
Yeah, I can categorically state that SunSmart and Cancer Council would not recommend olive oil as a sun protection measure. The only sunscreen you should be applying to skin is one that's been approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration.
Correct.
Now, this one's a good one because we do say that only apply sunscreen to children over 6 months or more.
Yeah.
And as we well know, young babies, when they've had something put on their hands or something, they like to suck and eat and things. So is it okay for the sunscreen chemicals to be orally digested, except example, when the children put sunscreen on their lips or they forget to wash their hands and then they put them in their mouth, that kind of thing?
If that is a concern, that's when I also would recommend or suggest to look for sunscreens that have zinc and titanium. If you think zinc is what we often find in baby barrier, the nappy rash creams, if we are really concerned that, you're going to go out in the sun with a young child or a baby, and you're going to put a lot of sunscreen on their arms because that's just the nature of the activity you're going to have, I will probably look for something that is specifically tested on children, and we everybody has, we have them in others. But if you're really concerned with the chemical UV filters, I would recommend going for one that has zinc and or titanium, because they're probably the gentlest and mildest, especially if there's a risk of ingestion.
And if you can't remember those ingredients, then you're looking for the label that says sensitive or toddler formula, because sometimes these ingredients lists can be very daunting. Yeah. So if you find that on the front, sensitive or toddler, you should be fine.
Yeah.
The next question, oh boy, this is the $65,000 question. How do you get teenagers to wear sunscreen and hats?
Oh, God, do I really want to walk into that? There is, one tactic could be to scare them. There's plenty of documentation showing the damage they're going to have for themselves by not being diligent with sun protection in their teenage years. I think one famous one that I remember is a truck driver, I believe is from the US, that actually shows half the face completely ruined and the other half not really, because that's the side that was by the window and received the sun, arm out, you're driving. That's the side that gets a lot of sun, reflected or direct. That is the reality of it. And it's difficult because teenagers think they're invincible. We've all been teenagers. And it's really doing it's like putting a seatbelt on. It's similar to other exercises that have now become the rule. That has to become the rule as well, because it's just that little bit of damage every day that will show up eventually. So it's like, I won't put the seatbelt on today. All right, I got away with it. I won't do it tomorrow. I won't do it the other day. Sooner or later, something bad is going to happen. And it's pretty much the same principle. Yeah. Communication is not easy at that age, but that's probably what I would go for.
And obviously, a lot of teenagers are getting into a stage where they really care about their skincare routine. So sunscreen is a very important part of a skincare routine and a beauty routine. Yes. And then it's about finding a hat that they actually like, sits comfortably on their head, looks good on them, is Instagram worthy or whatever social media. Finding a nice design. Yeah. So we will, someone else has mentioned about having access to information for families, and we certainly do have a lot of sunscreen information on our website, family notes. We've got, videos and all sorts of things. So we'll certainly send out links to those. But I think we've managed to go through all of those questions for now.
Cover all the questions,
You can find our details, sunsmart.com.au. And then if you've got any questions or you need anything from us, please email schools@cancervic.org.au. That will come to me, and then I can answer those.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much to everybody for attending. Bye.